seated, I just want to, again, welcome, especially if you're new or newer this morning. We're going to make a bit of a transition from the season we've been in and looking at vital signs of our faith, coming out of 1 John, to considering that last week we were talking about what it means to live not of this world, to not be in love with it, but recognizing that there's a God who said he so loves the world, that he gave himself for it. So there's this love for it. And what does it mean for us to be joining in that? So I want to begin by just asking you this question to maybe begin to ponder, and that is, why are you in Los Angeles? Or why do you live in this city? Why do you live in this city? For a lot of us, you might begin to think, well, it might involve circumstances, and you might just say, well, I was born here. Anybody? There's a few. There you go, Tom. I was born here too. So there's two of us. You know, it might be that you're born here. It might be that you came out here because you got a job here, and that led you out here. Or you came out for college and you just kind of stayed here. It might be because you have other family here. I know a lot of people say, you know, well, we've moved over to the area because I had a brother here or parents still here. So there may be the circumstances that have you here. For others, it might feel like, no, that it involves more of a choice. There's preferences for this place, and that's what drew me here. There's like some of you are going, dude, have you seen the weather in Boston? You know, like, why am I here? Because we don't have 25 feet of snow, you know, coming down. It could be the weather. It could just be the vibe. There's a lot of people who say, I like the West Coast, or I like Los Angeles, just that it fits my personality. And I think for a lot of people, and there's part of it has been historically, that there's just a sense of wanting to leave places where one felt kind of too confined. The truth is, there's always been that pioneering spirit that has made its way across the U.S., across this nation. And pioneers were the ones who came here, and pioneers kept coming west. You remember, go west, young man. Somewhere you'd settle along the way, but the true pioneering spirit would always go west. You can't get any further west than right here. It kind of ends here. So there's always been this sense of a place of exploration, a place to move and look and explore life in a more open way. Maybe that's part of the choice. But whether it's circumstances or it's been a choice, I don't think it answers most deeply why you're really here. I think God has more for us than that. The truth is that circumstances and choices like that, they can locate us, but they can't lead us. They can give you a mailbox, but they can't give you meaning about what it means to be here. They can define the place, but they can't define the real purpose of why you're here. And God has a higher purpose for what he's doing. There's something so much bigger, to quote the great prophet Spider-Man, when he turned and he says at one point, there's something bigger here than just us. There's something bigger at hand than just you and I. And God's inviting us always to give ourselves to what he is doing. For he is the one who's sovereign. He is the only one who can really call us into the true story. We can find ourselves in a lot of stories, try to imagine ourselves in some grand narrative of life. But there's one story, and it's his. And he's calling us into that. I think that what we need to realize is so often when it comes to the city, we see a place. That's all we see. We see a place. I can see it on the map, or I can drive through it. I see a place. But God sees purposes. God sees purposes of what he's doing. And what I want to help us to capture this morning as we partly launch into these 40 days, and however you're participating, wherever you are in your journey spiritually, whether you're just exploring what is God about, what do I really believe, I want to present to you that I think God is sovereign over all things and he has purposes, and that actually God invented the city. And that kind of doesn't really ring true with a lot of us, because we live in a time in which we want to almost curse the city. Oh, the city. Oh, the ails. Oh, the congestion. Oh, the violence. Oh, the tensions. And yet God invented the city. And he has purposes for that. We're told in the book of Hebrews that all throughout the Old Testament, the great patriarchs, when they were wandering through their journeys and their hardships, particularly when they're going through the wilderness, how they looked towards what God would ultimately do. They understood themselves not to have really found home yet. But what did they imagine? A garden at the end of everything? That they would return somehow to the simplicity of that? Not exactly. We actually read in Hebrews 11, verse 10, where it speaks of Abraham. And it says, he, Abraham, was looking forward to the city that has foundations, eternal foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Abraham had a sense that what God was doing was actually ultimately drawing together his purposes in the nature of a city. And then he understood he was a wanderer, but ultimately where he would go would be something of a city. And that's why we read, and some of you are familiar with reading Revelations, and you read of kind of these mysterious ways in which the end is described as God bringing forth a new heaven, a new earth, and it's like the city of Jerusalem somehow being infused back, and the end of all things is what? Is a city. It's described that we're heading towards a city. It even describes the roads of that city. It describes the dimensions of that city. It describes a city square of which God is at the center of. Some of us need to stop and go, wow, I didn't realize that, in truth, all human history began in a garden, but it ends in a city. Human formation may begin in a garden, but it actually is moving towards a city. As one pair of writers put it this way, they said, the world to come, Scripture teaches, will be an urban world. The redemption drama that began in a garden will end in a city, the New Jerusalem. Heaven's citizens will be urbanites, drawn by bonds of grace from all races, nations, language groups. New city citizens will live together in perfect harmony as God's redeemed people, his new covenant community. The truth is that God has purposes for a city. There is this whole work, and we need to grab that and let it kind of fill our hearts in the way that we even live here and think of ourselves living here and live here with his purposes flowing through us. And the truth is, there is this phenomena in which the world has been moving towards cities. In fact, it's such a powerful sociological phenomena that sometimes we miss the spiritual dynamic that's related to it. Sociologically, people have been fascinated with this because throughout most of human existence, people spread out. The human race spread out because there were more resources. Why gather together around resources? Spread out to find them. But things have turned, and people begin to get drawn together. And in our lifetime, in the year 2007, just a few years ago, is when the world finally crossed that point, and there are now more people living in urban city centers than outside of them. In just our short lifetime, this phenomenon has kind of ramped up. In 1950, only 30% of the world lived in cities. That's not long ago. Some of you were born and lived through that period. Only 30%. By 2014, now, last year, 54% of the world. That's a huge shift. They predict that by 2050, it will be 66% of the world that are living in city centers, in urban centers. That's a radical shift in the world. And we need to kind of understand how God has purposes in the midst of that, because we're living in that, and we're living out of that place. The truth is, life is being shaped by the nature of the city, and God has his purposes for it. Let me mention three that I draw from Tim Keller, and he drew from others, and as I kind of try to wrap myself around what I see God doing. The first is this, that the city releases human potential. The city releases human potential. If you read through the Old Testament, you see where God calls humanity to be those who are creative. He says that we bear a creative nature in us. We bear the ability to be co-producers with him, co-creators. It is our nature to produce and create. And there is something of that galvanizes together when people come together with that nature in them, and they bring their creative ideas and their creative resources together, when you pull those things together. And that was grasped. Even at the very beginning, it says that Cain formed a city, and his descendants were forming cities. And we find that the very first kind of creative stuff was flowing from those cities. The first music was flowing out of and written in the context of a city where people are gathered. The first kind of craftsmanship was formed out of the city where people are gathering. Something happens when people are gathered in cities. As one economics professor from Harvard wrote, he said, "Humanity is a social species, and our greatest gift is the ability to learn from one another. Cities thrive by enabling that learning, and they have become only more important as knowledge has become more valuable." There's something that is galvanizing when people come together and bring those resources. And what we find is this great purpose where God wants us to shine with our creativity and to bring forth what we can to be the best in terms of reigning over the world with Him, is that there's that dark underside. And that's why when we read also in the Scriptures, in Genesis 11, some may remember the Tower of Babel, where the people come together and they basically say, let's all get together and let's build this big tower, this big monument. And what do they say? So that we can make a name for ourselves. And so they're pulling their creativity, but for self-glorification. And there becomes the challenge that we have as people who live in a city, is that there is this grand purpose of being able to bring together that which glorifies the Creator and the source of all things, and that draw towards self-glorification. And you and I are part of those who live in a world who needs to see that redeemed. We need to be those who can see the bigger picture and say we can create, but for something bigger than ourselves, not something self-consuming. That which really serves greater purposes, that serves all people. And that is part of what we find in the midst of the purposes that God has, that we want to redeem that. A second thing is that the city is a place of refuge, bearing the hope and of justice and unity. It's interesting that in that same call where the people come together to want to build this Tower of Babel, this huge tower as a monument to themselves, where they think that somehow they will now become more like gods, one of the things they say is lest we be scattered. Why do they fear being scattered? Because when you're scattered, you're vulnerable. When you're on your own, you're vulnerable. That has always been true, and part of why cities have always been a source of being able to provide something more safe. You're not left to the wild. Not only the wild elements out in the world, but even kind of the wildness of the way people will do justice, which is not always doing it very well, if left to its own. And so they would gather, and for the first cities in the Scriptures were referred to as cities of refuge. Create for yourself cities of refuge, God told the people. Places in which it is safe. Because when one is kind of feeling different, or they may not get justice, or it may not be fair, you want to go to a place in which there's the formation of a greater sense of justice. You have to kind of raise the stakes and make some rules and live by these rules, and there's recourses to that end. Whereas if it's just kind of the law of the emotion going on outside, it's not safe. So people are drawn, and it's always been that way. And I think that's in part why those who face the worst hardships of this country ever, those who were enslaved and brought here under slavery, when they were seeking that emancipation, they would go to the city because the city had more hope to be able to find justice than left out there. That's why immigrants have often come to this country and gone to the cities, hoping that there would be more of a sense that they could find their fit and their place with others, because there was already diversity. So instead of being an outcast somewhere, maybe they could find a place in the diversity of the city. That's why many people who feel like they just don't fit other places say, I'm going to move to the city. I'm going to hope that there's a place for me there. And here comes the kind of the grand tension that's there. The dark side of that is that it's a place in which we can honor the value of people across all their differences. The city has an ability to do that like no other, but it's the place that we will face our prejudices like no other. Because it's here where all of a sudden you look around and go, gosh, not everybody's like me. Did you ever notice that? If you notice that, you live in a city. See, if you live outside of a city, if you live in a certain small town, you don't necessarily look around and find that people are different in their story, their background, their race. But in the city, you realize I'm amongst people who are so different. And it has the potential to glorify God like nothing else. It has the tension, though, also of raising up our prejudices. And you and I are going to have to deal with those. And part of what we're going to do in this time, in these weeks, is to go and face some of those issues. Our own prejudices and how we're going to be redeemers of the city. We have to be those who go and say, God, help me to recapture in myself your heart for this city. That it would be a place of justice and a place of hope for people. And thirdly, the city compels worship. That one might make you turn your head. You might think the city compels worship. But in truth, the city intensifies the spiritual forces of giving worth to something. If you think about it throughout the ancient world, and it's actually true more than we know today, most of the great cities of this world, certainly early on, were named after the god of that city, what people worshipped. And throughout the ancient times, the city would be named after the god, and guess what the tallest building in the city would be? It would be a temple to that god. It would somehow represent what people collectively had united and giving worth to. And that is what worship means. Worship really means, it comes from the English word worthship. Worship, and this is such a healthy way to think about it, is really about giving worth. It is not about singing songs. Singing songs is an expression of what we're giving worth to, what we're centering our lives in. And that's why it transforms us, because when you realign yourself with the proper orbit of life, you become more true and whole, and you are filled and connected to that source. But it's ultimately about, at its root, giving worth. And so when people collectively give worth, it's really a reflection of trying to find meaning, trying to collectively say, we know, we give ourselves collectively and to this. And that's why, again, every city raises those questions. What is it we're giving worth to? And it presses those questions more deeply, because one might feel like I'm just a small part of something big. What is the big? What is it that we're all trying to find meaning in together? What unites us? That's what a city compels us towards. And if you had looked at the landscape of much of, let's say, American cities, not long ago, even 50 years ago, through most of the U.S. history, what would have been the tallest building that was in the city? Church steeples, cathedrals. Look at the skyline. Go back and look at a picture of a city from just 50 years ago. People had gathered around the sense that God was the one that we should be honoring in this place. Now, what do you think are the tallest buildings in most cities? Financial centers. Sometimes the arts. Something else is drawing us. See, there's something in us that says that we've got to give our worth to something. And we're confused about what it is. You know, 9/11, we can interpret 9/11 a lot of ways. You know, come on. And even now we're still struggling to say, is this a religious thing or is this just an economic thing? The truth is you can't fully separate them. They chose to attack two towers that were mostly related to a financial district. So someone could say, well, that's not religious. Oh, it's deeply religious. See, we don't understand the nature of what religion is. Human religion, from that human point of view, is that which we seek to find ourselves in and respect and honor and give worth to. Oh, they attacked a religious icon, if we would understand that in that kind of sense. See, we say that we think that, oh, American cities, I don't buy this whole this worship thing, because we're very secular. Our city, Los Angeles, has become very secular. I don't think so. Not when you think that it's about people collectively finding worth and giving it to something. Then you realize, oh no, it's quite spiritual. And so we are people who are trying to understand that and face it, that God has a purpose. It is to draw people to their true worth. and for them to discover that like never before. And we are people who need to face the fact that we're a part of a culture that struggles with its own idolatries. We have the potential to find God at the center of things and find our worth in Him. But we have the greatest potential for idolatry, to give ourselves to things that really have no power, that really are trying to rule us but have no right to rule us. And that is part of what it means to be a people who live in the city and consider God's purposes as defining for them. God has purposes. And these are the things that I want to invite you, wherever you are, to press into realizing, wow, I want to live in this city as a city that God created and has purposes for. And that's what He intends for us to do. God wants us to carry His purposes for the city that we live in. That I am to carry God's purposes for the city I live in. You might think, gosh, when I think of carrying God's purposes for the city, I don't think so highly of the city. I just kind of want to ignore it. I really kind of wish I wasn't here. I wish there was nobody, or I was here but nobody else was here, or however you might want to think about it. But if there was ever a people who could have looked at the city and thought, oh, there is nothing God wants from this place. It's a wasteland. It should be cursed. It was the people who had been carried off into exile. God's people, the people that were supposed to be honored and lifted up on this earth as His own. Because of their own failures, God allowed them to be exiled by the worst. The Babylonian Empire finally comes and it besieges Jerusalem and takes away a number of inhabitants. This is about 596 BC. And many of those inhabitants are taken away. Then it comes and takes Judah, completely destroys it, and 10 years later takes all the people, and they are all living in exile from Judah. And for them to live in Babylon, it doesn't get worse. This is just like, we've lost everything. Now listen to the words that the prophet Jeremiah speaks to them, or writes to them at this time. In Jeremiah, we hear something of God's heart. He says, This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in numbers there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city in which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Notice how the thing he says a couple times there is this is the place you are, the place you want to curse, the place you want to dismiss. This is the place that I carried you. He's basically saying to them, you have not grasped the sovereignty of God. That even though there's something horrible about why you're there, and he's not saying that all the circumstances themselves are good in and of themselves, like many of you might be in LA for reasons that aren't always good. But ultimately, in the sovereignty of God, you are there. He was allowed them to be carried there. They are there. And that is significant. And so he says to them, I want you to really live there. And this is a strong word, but you kind of get the sense that he's saying, you probably feel like you just want to stay disconnected. I want you to actually give your lives, fully live there. Notice the words that stand out as he says, I want you to build and to settle and to plant and to eat and to marry and to increase in numbers. This is God calling them to really live where they are living. And I think those are really important words for us. For we live in a place, Los Angeles, that many people kind of stay disconnected to at times. Particularly the West Side is a place that people have tended to kind of come and say, it's fun for a while. I'm going to come and live here for a while, but it's not like I'm going to settle here. One day I'll probably go somewhere else. And that creates this mentality in which we're all kind of just passer-throughers, we're renters, we don't have a resident kind of mentality. And I've come to really believe that there is an enemy to the purposes of God, an enemy to our souls and our lives that has more right to residency than many of us. Very willing to live here and work out his effects and to draw people to himself and to destroy them. And a lot of us are like, well, whatever. We don't embrace our own sense of really living in the city. And there are spiritual consequences to that. He is calling for them to live as distinct people, but not separate people. To settle down as full-fledged neighbors with the people around them, but as redemptive neighbors. That's what becomes clear. You cannot become a redemptive neighbor if you don't first become a neighbor. Where you actually live there, and you embrace living there, and you embrace that the people around you are your real neighbors, and you have codependency of things on them. You need them for things, they need you, and you live in the fullness of that, and you give yourself to that. And you even would allow children to be born, if you have children, in that place, because you're saying, I do not believe it's accursed. There's God who is working here and has purposes here. But to be redemptive means we must be distinct. We must bring to bear the purposes of God in that place. And as Tim Keller would note, there is for us a calling to avoid some of the ways in which sometimes people of God have tried to live in cities. One of them being assimilating, where we just kind of assimilate. You know, I'm just gonna kind of get in here and work the city and fit in as best I can to see, because I want to get out of it what's here for me. And I think a lot of us just use the city to our own ends. We don't want to create waves. We don't want to change it. We just want to use it. And then there's also what could be referred to as a tribalism. Tribalism is kind of like, I want it to work for my people. We have our things that are good for us. And Los Angeles, what many would say is kind of supposed to be the grand melting pot, hasn't necessarily worked that way. Because of that tribalism, I think we look to other countries and we say, oh, it is horrible that these different ethnic groups have caused, horrific genocide even at times, the way that they treat, the contempt they have for each other. I think we ought to look at ourselves, because we have a lot of contempt right in this room. And we've got to start realizing that we have to face that. And that's part of what we want to do in these days, is learn that we're a people who can't be tribal in our own ways, saying, well, it's good for me as a white person, or it's good for me as a black person, or this is the rights of Hispanics. We actually have to learn that we're in this together, that we want to honor what is the good of all people. That's what honors God. And that means that we come as people who are not assimilators, and we're not, tribal in our views, but we're people who come united in God's glory in all things, and that we seek that, and that is something that must be shared. That is something where we come to seek a greater good in those things. And he says to go then and seek the peace and prosperity, what? Of ourselves, of our tribe? No, of the city. Seek it out, its peace and its prosperity. Now you can imagine for them to hear that word, seek the peace. That is the biblical word shalom, which means where everything is whole and set right and just, and it's kind of this ideal that God ultimately holds in himself. To seek that kind of peace where everything is right, they couldn't imagine that. That's what they had been looking for to work out in Jerusalem. It can't be there in Babylon. Yes, it can. See, we have this tendency to think, well, it only can work in the right place. I can only find peace when I get to the right place. And a lot of us in this room, if we're honest, we really think our peace will come when I go back to the place that I've always wanted to go back to, or I move on to the place eventually where I've always dreamed of living. And so our prayer to God is always, God, would you lead me to that place that I really love? And God wants to reverse that and say, God, will you teach me to love the place I'm in? And that's what we don't do. That's what we don't do. And that's the turning that I think, God, we have to start with, lest we be those who kind of want to curse or dismiss in some quiet way this city, just looking for our own good. He says, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city that you are in, whatever those circumstances are for however long. I'm not suggesting to you there are not good reasons why you might one day move. Not at all. I always feel the blessing upon it. Many people, I'm too blessed by so many of you moving here that I'm never going to bless somebody from moving out. But what I would say is this: as long as you're here, be here. As long as you're here, live here. Embrace it. Bless it. That is what he's calling for. And he goes on to say, in the city's welfare, you will have welfare. That's a simple idea. As you bless the whole, you ultimately gain from it. As God is able to see this city blessed instead of cursed, those who live in it will only find good things. His works, his purposes working out. And it serves the good of all. That's hard to do because I am so inherently selfish. So I see something and all I see is something to use. How does the city serve me? That's where I'm starting from. And I have to change from the inside out. I have to become more like Jesus, who came to this world not going, oh man, what can you do for me today? He came to seek and save what was lost. That's why he came. And he gave himself to seek and save what was lost. And he's calling me to give myself to this world in the city I live to seek and to save what was lost. So it changes us. We have to kind of overcome and face our own selfish way of seeing things. And I think it also means we have to change our sense of separatism, where we so often think, the way I feel good about myself is, I just see it as us and them. Every time I hear about the horrible things in the city, oh, those people. Oh, those people. Oh. There is no other people, folks. It's us. I mean, to some degree, people much more tragically live out and must face the consequences for living out some horrible things. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying there's nothing anybody does that is not also potentially at work in you. And we have to get to the point where we see ourselves more collectively in the city, not separated as us and them. And that's what God is recognizing his own people to do. And it says that they need to seek it. Seek it. Actually pursue it. Get up. Pray. Engage. Take an active part in the good of their city.